Hey, welcome back to Business 150, Introduction to Management. And this is now video number 3 in Module 2. Module 2, as you remember, we're looking at the history of thinking and study about management, looking at some historical theories. And now in this third video, we're looking at the behavioral approach to management. At the end of this particular video, we're hoping that you will be able to examine the major contributions of the behavioral approach to management and describe some of the advantages and disadvantages in implementing the behavioral approach in practice today. That's generally what we're looking at today. All right, so what can we tell you about the behavioral approach to management? It's the second of the major approaches. In the previous video, we looked at the classical approach, and this particular approach, the behavioral approach, focuses on human attitudes and behaviors, and that would be attitudes and behaviors about work and in work, both of individuals and groups of individuals. And one of the interesting things I can tell you about the behavioral approach is we stumbled upon it by accident. We were not looking to develop an approach to management that focused on human attitudes and behaviors. We just kind of got there without really intending to. That's just what the research and the data seemed to suggest. Let's see if I can explain this to you a little bit. This next slide we see here, the very famous Hawthorne Studies. That's something you should probably remember if you think about management. The Hawthorne Studies, so-called because they took place in a city called Hawthorne. And it was studies both in 1927 and 1932, sponsored by Harvard University, or should I say Harvard University, by a researcher by the name of Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo was a classical management researcher. He was working based upon the old premise we talked about in the last video, which was we really need to figure out how to make individuals more efficient at work. And so we're going to do some experiments with some folks with a control group and with an experimental group to figure out if we can find the optimal level of environmental factors that will optimize production efficiency. It sounds just like scientific management, right? In fact, that's what it was. It was scientific management, and the experiment revealed something a little different. So what was the experiment? The experiment was to work with workers at the General Electric Corporation who were making telephone relays. And specifically, it was working with folks, sets of female workers who were building telephone relays. They built a control group of several of these ladies and decided, as you can see there, to play with the light. In other words, to play with what I'm calling play with the light, but what we really mean is a detailed set of experiments to see if we change certain environmental factors, what's the great optimal cocktail that will yield the highest performance. And so what they did was, in their work area, first they increased the amount of ambient light, so it was brighter in there, and then they reduced the amount of ambient light and sort of measured the results, right? Not only did they do that, but they also did things like they gave them a brand new work break during the middle of the morning. And then they took the work break away. And then they brought the work break back, but at a different time, and this time with snacks. And then they took the work break away. And then you can tell what's going on here. They're trying to figure out what's the right cocktail of environmental changes to yield the most performance from this group of female telephone equipment workers. And here's the interesting thing they found out. What do you think happened when they increased the light? Well, production went up. And so what do you think would happen when they afterwards took the light away? Production went up. Huh? And then they introduced a work break in the middle of the morning and performance went up. And then they took away the work break and performance went up again. And so the researchers ended up asking themselves, what is going on here? Why is it that no matter what we do with the experimental factors, performance increases. This is not at all what you would expect based upon the theories of scientific management. And so they suspended the changes to the environment. They actually went and sat down and talked with these ladies and asked them, what exactly is going on here? Why the performance differences that keep going up? And the ladies said very simply, this is the first time working for this company we've had a bunch of people with lab coats and clipboards asking us questions. We feel really important, we feel really valuable, and that makes us happier at work, and so we increased our performance. This is something that scientific management had never considered. Well, that's not the only thing that they found. They actually took that experiment a couple years later, as you can see here back on the slide, and what they did was they took two groups of men who were making also communications equipment for General Electric, and they played with the money. What does that mean? It means that they put in place a brand new bonus system. Again, this is something that you would think is very much congruent with scientific management. And they watched what happened with this new piecemeal bonus program. What they found was that there were some overachievers who immediately would start increasing their performance above the norm, but then very quickly their performance dropped back into the average. And every time there was an individual performer who increased their performance above the norm, they quickly brought it back down again. And so they actually asked, what was going on here? And what they found was that no one in the group was letting anyone stand out. As soon as someone had greater than normal performance, the rest of the group of guys would say, hey, knock that stuff off. You're making the rest of us look bad. And so what was the conclusion out of this? The conclusion out of this really discovered human behavior is much more important in the workplace than we ever previously believed. In fact, people will perform differently based on how others treat them, how they believe others value them, how they feel at work, whether they're encouraged or depressed or demotivated. And these are, of course, conclusions that nowadays we look at and we say, well, of course these things are true. But remember, at this time, this was groundbreaking. They had never really considered the human being as a part of the equation. Remember, we concluded last lecture telling you classical management pretty much looked at human beings as just tools in the machine, not as valuable assets in and of themselves. And so this gave rise to the human relations movement at work that introduced the idea that workers respond primarily to the social context of their workplace, and that a basic assumption is that a manager's concern for workers will lead to increased satisfaction and increased performance. That relationship between the boss and employees is crucial to getting the most from your people. This eventually led to, within the behavioral approach, two different ways of looking at the employees you manage. And it was described as a theory X manager and a theory Y manager. And so just look at the left-hand column. Theory X managers generally believe about their employees that people do not like work and they try to avoid it. And therefore, managers have to control, direct, coerce, and even threaten their employees to get them to work towards organizational goals. In fact, people prefer to be directed, to avoid responsibility, and to want security. They have very little personal ambition. That's generally the way a Theory X manager looks at his employees, his or her employees. Now contrast that with the Theory Y manager. As you see there on the right-hand column of this chart, a Theory Y manager, in contrast, believes people do not naturally dislike work. People, in fact, are internally motivated to reach the objectives to which they're committed, and people will be committed to goals when they receive personal rewards for reaching objectives. In fact, a Theory Y manager believes that people will both seek and accept responsibility under favorable conditions, and that people have the capacity to be innovative in solving problems. Generally, a Theory Y manager believes people are bright, but too often their potential is simply underutilized by the organization. Now, let me ask you, have you ever worked for a boss that you really think was kind of more of a Theory X boss than a Theory Y boss? I have. And I'm willing to bet that many of you listening to this lecture have also worked for a Theory X boss versus a Theory Y boss. Now, here's something to think about. This is not in the textbook, but I'm going to ask you a question. If you ever had the misfortune of working for a Theory X kind of boss, do you think that boss started out his or her life in business as a Theory X person? Or were they eventually worn down to the point where they were led to believe everybody who works for me is lazy, nobody who works for me has any ambition? You see, I would be willing to bet that most managers don't start out as Theory X managers. They end up there because of bad experiences in their relationship with employees. Something to think about, right? So, as a result, where does the behavioral approach lead us to today? It leads us now to a field of study we call organizational behavior. Organizational behavior, you can see there, takes a holistic view of behavior in trying to understand and address individual, group, and entire organizational dynamics, processes. It's trying to study how is it we can get the best out of our people for the sake of our organizations. And so today, we can look back at the behavioral approach and realize it gave certain contributions to us. It gave insights into interpersonal processes, group dynamics, things like group motivation. It focused our attention on these kinds of processes to consider them in ways we hadn't before under the classical management approach. And it views employees now as valuable resources and assets rather than just simply a cog in the machine to be exploited and to get the most performance out of. But it's not without its own set of limitations. What are some of the limitations? No matter how many theories you want to come out with, human behavior is difficult to predict. You know this and I know this, right? People will do the strangest things. They'll surprise us still to this day. In real life, many managers are reluctant to adopt concepts from behavioral management because those things have in the past come from consultants and have been overpromised and underdelivered. Many managers have in the past said they've been approached by a consultant who said, hey, you give me your people for half an afternoon and your performance will increase by 25%. And so you did the workshop at the Marriott with the continental breakfast and went till 2 o'clock. People were really jazzed and encouraged for a week, and then performance went back to normal. And you spent $15,000 on this workshop and you didn't get the results you wanted. The next time someone comes along and says, hey, you know, behavioral management suggests that managers are going to be very reluctant to make any changes because burned once, don't burn me twice. And quite frankly, many times the findings of the research have simply not been communicated effectively to real-world managers. And as a result, many managers believe all of this soft stuff about treating people well, I still got to post my numbers, I still got to have my division perform, and so don't waste my time with this. I need to get people to perform. And so it can have a limited amount of reach. Now, hopefully, as you review this topic in the textbook and consider some of the things we've tried to introduce in this video, you can see some of the major contributions of the behavioral approach to management and describe some of the advantages and disadvantages in trying to put it in practice in today's organizations. So, I hope this is helpful. Of course, more on this topic in the textbook. I encourage you to dig in and really understand this content, and we will see you in the next lecture.